इस वेबिनार में शामिल हुए सभी लोगों को मैं अमन करता हूं। ये जो 36 साल के थिएननमेन स्क्वायर का जो एनिवर्सरी है, अभी जून 4 तारीख को, इसमें अमित जी ने अभी कहा है कि ऑफिशियल आंकड़े जो है वो कुछ 300 लोगों का हत्या हुई, या जो ब्रिटिश केबल जो उन्होंने कहा है कि कुछ कम से कम 10,000 लोगों का मृत्यु हुई इस थिएननमेन स्क्वायर में। अ, जटिल विषय यह है कि आंकड़े का नहीं है। जटिल विषय यह है कि अपने लोगों को ही मारा डाला उन्होंने। वो जो आइडियोलॉजी के तरफ से, और उनका मांगे इतना ज्यादा नहीं थी, सिर्फ करप्शन के बारे में या पॉलिटिकल रिफॉर्म्स ले आने में। लेकिन चीन का सरकार ने बहुत दबाव डाला, और इसके जो रिएक्शन इतना जटिल हुई, कठिन हुई, अ, ताकि ये हम अभी इस मैसेकर को विश्लेषण करना चाहते हैं अभी। और ये है कि उस दिन जब जो जून 3 रात को 4 तारीख सुबह सुबह जब ये मैसेकर हुई, तब उससे so when the massacre has happened on the June 3rd night and June 4th morning, there was a lot of commotion, there was a lot of uncertainty, there was a lot of concern for many millions of people in China, because it is not just in Tiananmen Square that this has happened. It has happened in the rest of the country as well. Peasants, workers, intellectuals, students, media person, and many others participated in these protests across the country. It is not just only in Tiananmen Square. And in Shanghai or in other cities, there has been a huge movement of people questioning the Communist Party's attitude towards the protesters. Since April 1989, since that period, when the protests began in order to commemorate the death of Hu Yaobang, who is considered to be a reformist and who is also, by the way, linked to the Tibet issue. He had initiated the reform in the Tibet-related matters, and the first delegation from the Dalai Lama had visited Tibet in 1970s. तो उन्होंने एक रिफॉर्म के मुद्दे लेके आए थे, बल्कि वो चाइना कम्युनिस्ट पार्टी यूथ लीग का मेंबर था, लीडर था, और वो आइडियोलॉजिकली बहुत स्ट्रांग थे। फिर भी उनको कहते हैं कि वो रिफॉर्मिस्ट लीडर है। तो उनका जो देहांत के बाद एक प्रोटेस्ट निकली थिएननमेन स्क्वायर में, वो जारी रहे। और कुछ दिनों के बाद जब मई 20 तारीख को एक मार्शल लॉ उन्होंने वहाँ पे स्थापित किया, और 3 लाख फौज को बुलाया, और उसके बाद जो एक मैसाकर हुई थी। तो अप्रैल 1989 was the main time when the protests began in Tiananmen Square. There is also the hunger strike that was observed in Tiananmen Square since April of that year. And we also see the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. He had introduced the glasnost and perestroika in 1986. So he visited Beijing in that year. And as a result, there is also a lot of public scrutiny, public participation in the Tiananmen Square. So the Soviet debates about the glasnost or openness also created conditions for the demands for more political reforms in China. So that was the context. And secondly, the 1980s reform program under the Four Modernizations program, which began in 1978, they are now taking roots. The four modernization programs are in agriculture, industry, science and technology, and defense. But people started questioning that where is the fourth modernization, which is in the political domain. That is, the Communist Party should share power with the people. Now, today the Communist Party is 98 million strength compared to the BJP, which has more than 120 million. So it is the second largest in the world today, the Communist Party of China. However, it has a representative system whereby it elects blocks, and these blocks, like for instance, the provinces, 30 odd provinces, they have representatives elected to the National Party Congress once in 5 years. These people elect the Central Committee, Politburo Standing Committee. In other words, the ordinary people in China have no role in the decision-making process. And this has resulted in the demands for the fifth modernization, that is in the political domain. Also, there is a demand for the freedom of the press and end to the party-state corruption. As you know, President Xi Jinping initiated anti-corruption drive for the past more than 10 years, and millions have been arrested or investigated in their terms. However, we see that the corruption has not ended, and this poses a big issue for the political stability in China. So that is the context for the Tiananmen Square massacre. The other is that Tiananmen Square itself has been an arena of protest from 1919. So there was the May 4th movement and also the April 5th movement in 1976. These are massive movements where people participated in the Tiananmen Square. So we see that the Chinese language for depicting these protests, or the international community, several scholars, journalists, etc., have depicted this as an incident. Some people have mentioned as a massacre. Some have mentioned as a crackdown, protest. Some have mentioned tragedy. But the Chinese official discourse is that this is a counter-revolutionary riot and a political storm or a political turmoil. Recently, there was a press release by the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Hung Lei, who mentioned about political turmoil for depicting this massacre. So there are, in scholarship, in media coverage, there are various terms to depict the situation that happened on June 4th, 1989. Students, intellectuals, workers, and peasants called for an end to corruption. There is also the demand for greater political transparency because, as we discussed before, there is no transparency in the Communist Party because these 7 people, the Politburo Standing Committee members, rule the rest of the country and sometimes ruthlessly. And the lack of transparency creates a lot of problems. So the 1989 protesters have focused on this transparency aspect and also freedom of expression. While some of these have been included in the amendment to the Constitution in 1992, nevertheless, there are a lot of problems in actual implementation. For example, the 1982 Constitution, which was amended in 91-92, has provisions for free assembly, freedom of speech, religion, acquiring property. However, in the implementation stage, there is a problem for all of these freedoms, and hence there is the increasing dissent in China. Student leaders like Wang Tan, Wu Kaishi, Chai Ling, Shantung, Liu Kang, Fang Zungde, Li Lu, or Wang Youcai, these are the major leaders who participated in the Tiananmen Square protests. However, what China did was to allow them to go away from China so that they can prepare the ground for repression among the students, intellectuals, and others who participated. But the Tiananmen Square protests also had workers like Han Tungfang, Lu Qinghua. Many of them have worked in the factories. They are the working class leaders. So the Communist Party saying that it represents the workers is also problematic because workers themselves participated in these protests. There are also intellectuals like Liu Xiaobo, who received the Nobel Peace Prize later, and he was put in jail and he passed away allegedly with cancer. He was not allowed to go outside, nor his wife was allowed to see him. For the audience, I would like to mention that you need to read his book, Liu Xiaobo's book, No Enemies, No Hatred, which is a fantastic book explaining how Gandhian methods are followed in terms of these protests. So there is a lot of good ideas reflected in this book by Liu Xiaobo. But there are also other intellectuals like Tai Ching, an environmentalist, and Cui Jian, a rock star, who also participated in these protests. So, as I just mentioned, there is a huge list of people from all across the walks of life in China participated in these Tiananmen Square massacre protests initially, and then they were all dispersed. Many of them are abroad today. And as we saw in Hong Kong, when many student leaders participated in the last 4 or 5 years of protests, we saw, for instance, Hoshua, a young student from Chinese University of Hong Kong. He would sit in demonstration, but he will bring his book reviews, assignments, and term papers to be written. So he would quietly sit in protest, but start writing his book reviews and others. So likewise, in Tiananmen Square, you saw a bouquet of ideas coming in and a variety of people participating in these protests to make it much more colorful, and that resonated across. So there was this democracy salon, lawn salon at Beijing University, and some intellectuals like astrophysics professor Fang Lichu, who later on went to the American embassy in Beijing and escaped to to the United States. So such was the participation in these protests against the one-party rule and for the democratization process. They have challenged the authority and the legitimacy of the ruling party. 400 cities witnessed protests in China at that point of time. And these are sometimes traced to the inequality that is coming up due to the reform program, the inflation, the consumer price index increased to over 30% in 1989. Unemployment, common grievances were also increasing. So students basically called for greater accountability, constitutional due process, and the freedom of press and speech. Of course, the Communist Party itself was divided between hardliners and moderators. Chen Yun, who famously or infamously called for the cage and the bird philosophy, that the bird has to be kept all the time in a cage. Basically, a Stalinist project that he had put forward. But there are also others like Premier Li Peng, Li Xiannian, who was the president, Wang Chen, Qiao Shi, Yao Yilin, Li Ximing, Chen Shidong of Beijing, Chu Haotian, the military leader who later became the defense minister, Liu Huaqing, a naval admiral who had given the expansive program for the Chinese naval forces. These are all part of that hardliners who finally led to the resolution to counter the counter-revolutionaries, as they called. But there are also moderators like Zhao Jiang, who was later put in house arrest, and he passed away in house arrest. Hu Qili, Pao Tong, Yan Mingfu, Xu Qinqian, who suggested for a conciliatory approach between the party and the students, between the military which was deployed and the students. And they held discussions with the protesters and trying to accommodate some of their demands. But the moderators' position was jettisoned by the hardliners, and we saw the massacre after the martial law was declared on May 20th, 1989. And Yang Taiping, who was the general, PLA general, and his brother, Yang Shangkun, who was the president of the People's Republic of China, they undertook these massacre actively on the Chinese students and other protesters. So how it was suppressed? The martial law was one of the major consequences which resulted in the massacre because the soldiers and security forces were all deployed in the city, checkpoints, and trying to restrict the movement of the protesters. There is also an attempt to negotiate. The protesters tried to negotiate, but that could not really be carried forward because hardliners gained strength within the party hierarchy, and the resolution finally was passed to counter the students. So finally, on June 3rd night, the Chinese government initiated the violent by shooting. Live ammunition was used, tanks were rolled, armored personnel carriers were sent to counter the protests through tear gas, batons, weapons to disperse the crowds. So they were everything helter-skelter, and we saw by the next day those many people were killed in Tiananmen Square. So the media was blacked out, and the suppression took place also across China. In Shanghai, Jiang Zemin claimed to have clamped down on all the protesters, and he was rewarded uh, and promoted for being the general secretary of the Communist Party and the PLA chief, the Central Military Commission chief. So basically, today, in the last 36 years, Tiananmen Square is reflected in terms of, as most of the audience would recollect, the tank man memories. The lone person who opposed the rolling of the tanks. And that is the dilemma. That is the main problem for the Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army. In China, everything is preceded by People's Republic of China, People's Liberation Army, and so on and so forth. But here, the major dilemma was they were shooting their own people. And so there was a huge problem um, for the Communist Party and the military forces. In fact, many military leaders tried to wriggle out of this by circulating letters in protest against the massacre. However, these were also sidelined by the Communist Party. Um, the fact that these Tiananmen Square protests reverberate in China is reflected 3 years ago as well, in November 2022, when we had protests in China to protest against the lockdowns of the COVID pandemic. Many cities in China have been locked down. 400 million people were affected. And the Chinese protested against these lockdowns, which are unjust, because across the globe, the, the people were not in the lockdown conditions. In fact, in China, people were looking at the FIFA, the football being played in Qatar, and nobody was wearing any mask. So these protests were called white paper protests, or the A4 size. We all take a printout on an A4 size page, right? So people started putting the white paper as a protest that is blank about 3 years ago. There is also the civil society ongoing activism in China, even today, taking inspiration from the Tiananmen Square protests. There are mass protests, there are commemoration protests annually, specifically in Hong Kong. But for the past 3 years, Chinese government, which now controls the Hong Kong government, even though it was supposed to observe one country, two systems, yet we see the central government influencing. So they have clamped down on all the protests in Hong Kong, which used to be a beacon for these protests for over a long period of time, nearly 30 years. They have now been shut down, which indicates that the commemoration protests annually would have to shift to other areas across the globe. There is also the civil society rights consciousness groups, which have been spearheading these campaigns. So, what are the lessons learned in the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989? For the past more than 3 decades, one of the main lessons learned is the accountability of the Communist Party, the legitimacy and responsibility of the Communist Party to look at the welfare of the people. The Communist Party, after 1989, promised to the students to go back home on the condition that they will tackle corruption. Number two, they will also increase the economic growth rates. It is true that China's economic growth rates increased to 9.6% on an average in the first 3 decades of reform. However, in the last 14, 15 years, the growth rates have fallen to about 4 to 5%. If we assume these official figures are correct, because there are other indicators like the rhodium group, which mentions the Chinese growth rate is only about 2%, slightly about 2%. So if these figures are correct, still the Chinese government's promise that they will maintain economic growth rates has not been kept. And so there is the responsibility aspect. Uh, the second lesson learned is that the competitive politics is not possible in China during the Communist Party's rule. And so there is the civil society arguments in China to enhance the competitive politics. The Communist Party did try village level elections, but Communist Party is not located at the villages. It is located at county or a tehsil in our parlance. So there is less competitive politics or decentralization. And so this is the limitation of the implementation of the decentralization and democracy at the village level, because the leadership centralizes all power among the Politburo Standing Committee members. There are just about 7 people in China who control 1.47 billion people. And so this is the authoritarian streak. Tiananmen Square protests also are reflected in current day China in a number of ways. Uh, um, in terms of the mass incidents that Chinese premier used to mention in the National People's Congress. So we see those in different ways. However, recently, since the 19th Communist Party Congress, China has been suggesting that it wants to export its party state authoritarian model to the rest of the world. And so this is the danger for most of the democracies abroad, that China wants to export its authoritarian model by also financing infrastructure projects and others. So there is a lot of incentivization by the Communist Party, also wooing many states, especially authoritarian states, to try and learn and implement the Chinese authoritarian model. So this is a major challenge for the international community in terms of what we learn from the Tiananmen Square protests. China did see a lot of democratic dissent, and the number of protests have increased. However, many of these are labor disputes, wage arrears, land rights, especially in the villages, environmental issues, socio-economic or legal grievances. And several um, uh, surveys conducted by the international community members, like the Freedom House China Dissent Monitor, China Labor Bulletin, Stratfor, or there is one Dr. Chen in Taiwan, Academia Sinica, who counts every day, analyzes all of these protest forms in China. However, he argues that 52% of these protests are basically socio-economic or local grievances. So, for example, in 1994, 5 years after the Tiananmen Square protests, 10,000 people participated in these mass incidents. Mass incident is any incident where more than 1,000 people participated in the protest. So 10,000 into 1,000 protesters happened in 1994. The figures for 2000 increased to 40,000 58,000 in 2003, 1,20,000 in 2008, 1,80,000 by 2010. So the Chinese premier used to give these figures in their parliament, the National People's Congress sessions, but he stopped providing that statistics for the past 15 years. However, Tsinghua University and other universities conducted surveys. They found for the last traceable survey, open survey in 2011, 230,000 protests in China. In other words, Tiananmen Square is still uh, visible in major cities and places in China. So, uh, in order to commemorate these more than 3 decades of the Tiananmen Square protests, here today we are assembled to pay respects to all those who departed in that, but with the signaling that the flames live forever. So, with this, let me stop this brief intervention. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful, thought provoking lecture on this particular issue. And you have covered almost all the aspects related to Tiananmen Square, and you have contextualized this protest. In what circumstances people have started their protest over there in 1989 until date. Some of Tiananmen Square protest is still inspiring various people in China for their civil rights. सो सर ने अपने लेक्चर में काफ़ी सारी चीज़ों को इंगित किया है और ये बताने की कोशिश की है कि टियानमेन स्क्वायर ने आज तक प्रजातंत्र को लेके या जो एक लोकतांत्रिक असहमति की बात जो है वो आज भी चाइना में कहीं ना कहीं नजर आती है और चाइना के लोग अपनी आवाज को उठाने के लिए सड़कों पर आते हैं, लेकिन वो उतनी बड़ी संख्या शायद नहीं है, या वो डेटा खुलकर चाइना की जो कम्युनिस्ट सरकार है वो बाहर भी नहीं आने देती, और पिछले 15 साल का जो डेटा है वो उन्होंने छुपा कर रखा हुआ है। लेकिन ज्यादातर जो प्रोटेस्ट हो रहे हैं वो लोकल डिमांड्स को लेकर हैं, जो सोशियो इकोनॉमिक प्रोटेस्ट हैं वो किए जा रहे हैं, वो शायद रेजीम चेंज करने को लेकर या प्रजातंत्र को एक बड़े लेवल पर चीन में स्टैब्लिश करने को लेकर नहीं है, या अगर ऐसे हैं भी तो चाइना वो डेटा बाहर आने नहीं देता है। और जो अलार्मिंग बात है मेरे लिए, जो सर ने बोला कि चाइना में जो अथॉरिटेरियनिज्म है, कि सिंगल पार्टी रूल है, अपोजिशन के लिए कोई जगह नहीं है, और कोई भी अगर सरकार की नीतियों को अपोज करने की कोशिश करता है तो उसे ब्रूटली क्रश कर दिया जाता है या उसको देश छोड़ने पर मजबूर किया जाता है। लेकिन चाइना अब अपने अथॉरिटेरियन रेजीम को बाहर भी फैलाना चाहता है, और उसके लिए वो हर प्रकार की तथाकथित इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर की मदद, पैसों की मदद, इकोनॉमिक एड वगैरह दे रहा है। और मुझे लगता है कि जिस प्रकार से उनकी मित्रता पाकिस्तान के साथ बढ़ रही है और आसिम मुनीर जिस प्रकार से ताकतवर होते जा रहे हैं, तो वो एक एग्जाम्पल है कि पाकिस्तान में गाहे बगाहे अथॉरिटेरियनिज्म आता रहता है, नहीं मिलिट्री रूल आता रहता है। म्यांमार के साथ भी उनके संबंध कुछ इस प्रकार से हैं, क्योंकि कुछ समय पहले वहां डेमोक्रेसी थी, लेकिन म्यांमार में अभी सैनिक शासन है। तो ये मुझे लगता है पूरे विश्व के प्रजातंत्र के लिए चाइना का जो मॉडल है अथॉरिटेरियनिज्म का, वो एक बहुत बड़ा खतरा प्रस्तुत कर रहा है, जो सर ने अपने लेक्चर में बहुत अच्छे से इन सारी बातों को हाईलाइट किया है। जहां तक मेरा मानना है, कुछ समय पहले ही वेस्ट एशिया में प्रो डेमोक्रेसी मूवमेंट हुए थे, और वेस्ट एशिया ने उन आंदोलनों का नाम जो स्टार्टिंग में यानी अरब स्प्रिंग से पहले जैस्मिन रेवोल्यूशन दिया था। तो चाइना कहीं पर भी प्रो डेमोक्रेसी मूवमेंट होता है तो इतना डर जाता है कि उस समय चाइना ने अपने देश में जैस्मिन के फूलों को भी बैन कर दिया था। 2014 में जब प्रो डेमोक्रेसी मूवमेंट हांगकांग में हुआ तो उसका नाम अम्ब्रेला मूवमेंट रखा गया। और मेरे जैसा रिसर्चर ये सोच रहा था कि कहीं चाइना अब अम्ब्रेला को भी बंद ना कर दे चीन में, कहीं उस तरह की हरकत भी ना कर दे। तो चूंकि 1989 एक विश्व राजनीति को बदलता हुआ मूवमेंट
अमित
था।
जी,
जी।
मेरे ख्याल से ना कुछ अगर आप प्रश्न ले लोगे ना,
हाँ बिल्कुल
कुछ
बिल्कुल।
ट्वीट करने लगे
तो
लोग ना।
1989 में क्योंकि रशिया ने उदारवाद की नीति को अपनाया था और उसके बाद रशिया का विघटन हुआ, तो शायद वो डर चाइना में अभी भी है कि अगर उन्होंने भी इस तरह की उदारवादी नीतियां अपनाई तो चाइना खत्म हो जाएगा। और वो जिस तरह से वन चाइना पॉलिसी की वकालत करता है, मुझे लगता है कि इंडिया को इस पॉलिसी को लेके भी थोड़ा सा रिकैलिब्रेट करना पड़ेगा। तो अब जो मंच है वो प्रश्नों के लिए खुला है। तो आपके अगर प्रश्न हैं तो अगर आप उसको चैट बॉक्स में लिखेंगे तो भी अच्छा है, या फिर अगर आप अनम्यूट करके पूछना चाहते हैं तो अपना आप नाम बताइए और संक्षिप्त में सिर्फ एक ही प्रश्न आप पूछ सकते हैं।
अमित जी,
जी।
मैं विजेंद्र, आवाज आ रही है?
जी जी सर, आ रही है।
हाँ, सर से मेरा एक सवाल ये है कि भारतीय मीडिया में इस जो मैसेकर है, या जिसको हम एक नरसंहार भी कहते हैं, इसकी बहुत कम कवरेज जो है वो हुई। और विजय गोखले की किताब अभी जो वहां पर भारत के राजदूत थे, तो वो मैं देख रहा था उसको, तो उन्होंने कहा कि भाई इंडिया टुडे ग्रुप के जो अपने शेखर गुप्ता और प्रशांत पंजियार, दो लोगों की कवरेज जो है वो हमें देखने को मिलती है। मतलब बहुत मामले को इंडियन मीडिया में भी उस समय कवर नहीं किया गया, किताबें भी बहुत ज्यादा लिखी नहीं गई। तो इसका क्या कारण है? मतलब ये सर से मुझे थोड़ा सा समझना है।
सर दो तीन और प्रश्न ले लें या एक एक करके, जैसा आपको ठीक लगे।
इसका डिस्कस करते हैं।
जी जी।
धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद वो प्रश्न आपने उठाया। क्यों भारत में कोई दिलचस्पी नहीं है इसके बारे में, या पब्लिसिटी क्यों नहीं दिया गया है स्कॉलरशिप में या मीडिया में या दूसरे जो मंच पर। अ, तो इसका जवाब ये है कि 1989 में जब ये हुई, उस समय के जो प्रधानमंत्री राजीव गांधी ने कहा है कि ये इंटरनल मैटर है, ये चीन का इंटरनल मैटर है। तो हम नॉन इंटरफेरेंस पॉलिसी अपनाते हैं, तो हम इसके बारे में कुछ कहना नहीं चाहते हैं। तो अगर सरकार ऐसे कहती है तो तब मीडिया और ये भी बहुत सारे लोग वैसे प्रोटेस्ट किया उस समय। मैं जेएनयू में स्टूडेंट था अ, उस समय, और हम भी प्रोटेस्ट में निकले उस समय। और एक सॉलिडारिटी मूवमेंट हुई थी। तो सारे जगह यूनिवर्सिटीज में या दूसरा जो एजुकेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशंस में एक प्रोटेस्ट जारी थी उस समय। लेकिन किताबें ज़्यादा नहीं लिखी, किताबें या मीडिया कवरेज उतना ज़्यादा नहीं थी आ, मेरा याद में। और दूसरा यह है कि जो भारत के जो कम्युनिस्ट पार्टीज जो भी है वो भी आ, आ, उनके खिलाफ आ, आ, बहुत पाबंदी लगाया या उसके खिलाफ पब्लिश करने के लिए मना भी किया। जैसे कि आप जानते हैं कि दिल्ली में बहुत सारे लेफ्ट लीनिंग पत्रकार हैं, तो ये मुश्किल होता है कि वहाँ पे पब्लिश करना। अ, तो ये भी एक वजह हो सकती है। तो ये एक चीज
मेरा
है।
मूड खराब हो रहा था।
लेकिन मुझे याद था।
पॉलिटिकली स्ट्रांग थे, मीडिया में भी उनका दखल, दैट्स व्हाई दिस इज द रीजन आई थिंक, मैं जो समझ पा रहा हूँ।
आ,
और पॉलिटिकल विल नहीं थी कि इस
हम्म,
मामले को ज्यादा जो है वो किया जाए। बीइंग ए डेमोक्रेटिक कंट्री होते हुए भी हमने ये देखा।
हाँ। लेकिन सितंबर 2014 में प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी जापान पहुंचे। वहां पे एक स्टेटमेंट दिया था उन्होंने कि हम भारत का जो फॉरेन पॉलिसी ऑब्जेक्टिव्स में वी सपोर्ट डेमोक्रेसीज अब्रॉड। तो टोक्यो, चूजिंग टोक्यो इज सिंबॉलिकली वेरी सिग्निफिकेंट, क्योंकि वहां से आपको दो अथॉरिटेरियन रेजिम्स दिखता है, एक नॉर्थ कोरिया, एक चीन। तो अम, तो तब से भारत के जो यूनाइटेड नेशंस के जो डेमोक्रेसी फंड, उसमें ज़्यादा पैसे डालने लगे, और सिविल सोसाइटी को बढ़ाने के लिए भी कोशिश किया उस समय से। अ, तो आपने सही कहा कि सरकार के जो पोजीशन भी एक महत्वपूर्ण इन्फ्लुएंस हो सकती है, जो डिस्कोर्सेस में या उनके खिलाफ लड़ने के लिए।
हाँ।
सर एक छोटा सा लेकिन महत्व है, एक हिंदी की बहुत बड़ी संपादक उस समय में, जब भी इस दिन ये घटना हुई। सर आवाज आ रही है?
जी जी।
हेलो,
जी
जी
कहिए
सर,
ना।
आ रही है।
अमित जी आवाज आ रही है?
हाँ बिल्कुल सर, आ रही है।
हाँ,
हाँ
तो उन्होंने एक, हाँ में एक जिक्र किया कि जो शहरी युवा था ये बहुत हताश था, निराश था, जो रिफॉर्म्स हो रहे थे उनका लाभ इस मिडिल क्लास शहरी युवा को नहीं मिल रहा था। इवन कि उन्होंने तो यहाँ तक को जूते काटने आए थे, उनके जो बच्चे वो ज्यादा पैसे कमा रहे थे, और जो लड़कियां थी उनकी जो गर्लफ्रेंड्स थी वो उन पैसे वालों के साथ ज्यादा जाना पसंद करती थी। कॉलेज में पढ़ने वाला जो ये युवा वर्ग था वो ज्यादा हताश था, उस तक वो ला तो इसमें कितनी सच्चाई है सर? ये एक बड़े संपादिका है, उनका नाम भी करके तुम्हें बीबीसी का स्टेटमेंट।
I did not understand the full question. There was some interruption in between. But if you are saying that the personal issues of A or B or C, that cannot be generalized. But it is true that there is a lot of socio-economic stress during the reform period. चीन का सरकार, चीन का कम्युनिस्ट पार्टी ने सब सब बेच दिया, जो पब्लिक गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज और एसेट्स जो है वो सारा बेच दिया उन्होंने। इससे बहुत नुकसान हुई अ, लोगों को, और इससे अ, उनका जो सोशो इकोनॉमिक प्रॉब्लम्स भी ज़्यादा बढ़ गए। आपका प्रश्न मैं सीधा सुन नहीं पाया, तो थोड़ा सा डिसरप्शन थी बीच में।
थैंक
सर
यू,
आई
थैंक
हैव
यू सर, थैंक यू
अमित
विजेंद्र
जी,
जी।
दूसरे लोगों के प्रश्न भी
हाँ,
ले लो।
और भी कुछ लोग हैं विजेंद्र जी।
जी।
डॉक्टर मानसी मल्होत्रा, यू हैव सम क्वेश्चन, सो प्लीज अनम्यूट योरसेल्फ। Otherwise, there are few question in the chat box.
I have
So
also I
Harshit
also have one
Bhardwaj,
question.
yes, Harshit Bhardwaj is saying, sir, thank you, sir, for the wonderful session. And I am very new to China studies. Please recommend one or two books for me to understand China better. Another question is, जब चीन में इतने सारे प्रदर्शन हो रहे हैं, तो फिर भी वहां लोकतंत्र क्यों नहीं आ रहा है सर?
हाँ, ये अच्छा प्रश्न था आपका। अ, एक तो चीन का जो कम्युनिस्ट पार्टी, उनका दबाव ज्यादा है। और अभी अगर आप चीन जाते हैं उसमें कौन सी जो इंस्टीट्यूशन ज्यादा रिक्रूट कर रहे हैं आबादी के, एक इंस्टीट्यूशन आपको जरूर दिखेगा, वो मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ स्टेट सिक्योरिटी, मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ पब्लिक सिक्योरिटी, जो होम मिनिस्ट्री और वगैरह जो हम होम मिनिस्ट्री कहते हैं। इसका मतलब यह है कि वो डिफेंस बजट के ज्यादा इंटरनल सिक्योरिटी के ऊपर ध्यान देते हैं। और हमारा लॉ एंड ऑर्डर जो है वो स्टेट्स का है कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में। लेकिन चीन में सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट का रेस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है ये। तो internal security budget is higher than the defense budget in China. So with that, we can see which is in more demand. चीन में आप अगर बाहर जाते हैं तो कम से कम 1-2 मिनट में एक बार आपको सर्वेलेंस कैमरा कैप्चर करती है। आपके जो एक्सप्रेशंस, फेशियल रिकग्निशन, वो सारा भी उन्होंने कैप्चर करते हैं। और आजकल जो आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस से बहुत सेंट्रलाइज हो गया है ये जो इंफॉर्मेशन, तो बहुत मुश्किल है चीन में कोई प्रोटेस्ट निकालने में। आ, फिर भी बहुत सारे लोग, हजारों लोग फिर भी आज आज भी डेमोन्स्ट्रेट करते हैं। तो इसका the fact of the matter is that we see a lot of protests in China, even with so much of surveillance. So that indicates that people are still remembering the Tiananmen Square protests. They still value the kind of uh, aspirations that the people have.
Thank you, sir. Vipin ji.
Yes, I have two interrelated questions. First, the impact of President Xi on the civil liberty and political system of China. And next part of this, is there any possibility of China becoming democracy in near future?
On the civil society and on whether China can become democratic. The last question first. Can China become democratic? It's quite possible in future. At the moment, the Communist Party has a huge repressive mechanism, so it is not possible right now. However, Mao Zedong wrote an article when the prairie fire spreads, then nobody can stop these. तो मुझे लग रहा है कि अगर ये प्रोटेस्ट इंक्रीज हो जाएं चीन में, तब वो किसी ने रोक नहीं पाएंगे. So it is quite possible that these protests will result in a huge negative impact on the Communist Party's governance. It is already happening. I mentioned to you about the village level elections. There are something like 8 lakh villages in China, and they conduct elections. I had observed these elections in China, and these are relatively free and fair. However, the problem is twofold. One, villages do not have the Communist Party branches. So Communist Party is not subjected to pressures from below, from the people on this count. Secondly, most of the sarpanchas who are elected, they become Communist Party members or Communist Party sympathizers. So it is one way of reducing the influence of the democratic experiment. So if the Communist Party experiments with elections at the county level, then we can say that China is experimenting with democracy, at least at the local levels. लेकिन अभी हो नहीं पा रहा है. The third feature of this is that the Chinese Communist Party is now allowing some kind of a social democratic experiment we saw in European countries on social welfare benefits. On, for example, if you are going and protesting on the pensions, lack of pensions, then the Communist Party is telling the people, go to the pension commission, the EPF, like in India, rather than protest against the Communist Party. So in other words, Communist Party is trying to tell the people, you go to the court, go for a litigation, or protest against the service provider. In this case, for example, the EPF Commission, Employment Provident Fund Commission, or some such organization in China. So in other words, the Communist Party is washing off its hands on the problems that are emerging at the local level by providing an alternative to the consumer to protest against the service provider rather than on the Communist Party. But even this is not very successful. So they are protesting. एक अजीब सा बात है कि जब मैं पढ़ रहा था चीन में, आप अगर कोई भारत के अखबार खोलते हैं, आपको थर्ड पेज में या चौथा पेज में आपको एंगेजमेंट कॉलम्स मिलेगा. उसमें इंडिया इंटरनेशनल सेंटर में इस दिन ये जो कॉन्फ्रेंस है, या यहाँ पे जो कन्वेंशन सेंटर में ऐसे एक प्रोग्राम चल रही है, वैसे आपको दिखेगा भारत के अखबारों में. आपको यकीन नहीं होगा कि चीन के अखबारों में वो कहेगा कि शनिवार को या रविवार को या जो भी दिन हम मेयर के दफ्तर के सामने प्रोटेस्ट करेंगे और सभी शामिल हो जाएंगे. तो ऐसे भी एडवर्टाइजमेंट्स आपको मिलेगा चीन के अखबारों में. तो ये भी एक डिसेंट्रलाइजेशन है जिसके जो authoritarian structures are generally kind of reduced in terms of their influence, or at least an alternative is provided. So these are the three methods where we can see some changes rather than a completely totalitarian structure. Currently, it is still an authoritarian structure. However, there are limited freedoms given, such as the local level elections in the villages, but not at the national, provincial, prefectural, or county level where this democratization has not happened. So this is one answer for whether they become democratic. आपका पहला प्रश्न था सिविल सोसाइटी, Xi Jinping and civil society. Now, 1982 Constitution, which was amended in 91-92, they have provisions for private property, freedom of private property. तो आजकल आप जमीन 90 साल तक आपके पास रह सकते हैं चीन में, या कोई अपार्टमेंट अगर खरीदना चाहते हैं तो यू आर फ्री टू बाय those apartments in China. That is yours. You can also inherit to your children likewise. So it will be yours. However, the other democratizing elements have not been instituted, like the protests, freedom of expression वगैरह. चीन में आप किसी के ऊपर चिल्ला सकते हैं, प्रोटेस्ट कर सकते हैं, बट द थंब रूल इज यू कैन नॉट राइट. वो तुरंत सेंसरशिप हो जाता है. आप भाषण में किसी को क्रिटिसाइज कर सकते हैं, लेकिन लिख नहीं पाएंगे आप, क्योंकि वो सेंसरशिप में वो सारा निकाल जाएगा. तो दिस इज द लिमिटेशन इन चाइना's freedom of speech. But with the freedom of property, there is now a huge middle class in China. लगभग 40 करोड़ स्ट्रेंथ के चीन में मिडिल क्लास एक तैयार हुई है. तो they keep demanding more rights. However, the Chinese middle class is not active as the other middle classes across the world. So this is the limitation in the democratization of China. The middle class in China is satisfied if their property is protected, if their other interests are protected, but not about the democratization. So there is a limitation here in terms of the middle class. Xi Jinping also introduced a new phenomena, that is nationalism. तो मिडिल क्लास के पास अभी वो नेशनलिज्म एक स्ट्रांग मजबूत हो गया, और this has now also exposed limitations in democratization. So these are the things that have been influencing China's politics. Can China become democracy in the short term? I doubt very much, because the Communist Party's surveillance systems are very, very intensive. And they are spending a lot of money on this. And so I doubt if in the short term this is possible. In the medium term, it is quite possible because people are dissatisfied. And so we should see how they would respond in future.
Thank you, sir. Can we take 2-3 question or will
Yeah,
end here?
yeah, please.
Okay. I'm taking one question from the chat box. One student is Stephanie from Indonesia, and she is thanking you for your insightful lecture. And she's asking you, okay, I would like to ask about the younger generation in mainland China, many of whom seem to have limited knowledge about the Tiananmen Square massacre. Does this indicate that the government is intentionally engaging in censorship or promoting narrative that discourage inquiry into democratic values?
Thank you very much for that question. My answer is that the younger generation in China have forgotten, many of them have forgotten about the Tiananmen Square events because of the censorship. And Hong Kong used to be the place for many publications. However, in the last 5-6 years, many journalists have been killed. Many journalists have been arrested or injured by bomb throwing or by beating up or other violence incidents. Hong Kong used to have a lot of vibrant publications reminding people of the Tiananmen Square massacre. However, today, even Hong Kong is gone in terms of those publications. So, in terms of our memory reproduction, this is not possible in China unless until somebody has some information available, and they have hidden from the public view, at least from the surveillance systems. So even though today China has 5G networks, it has good broadband connectivity, etc., but China has clamped down on any information to reach out to the Chinese youngsters. So they were told that you can make money or you can enjoy your life, but never question the Communist Party nor ask for democracy. So this is one problem with the younger generation. They do not have access to information. one other exception is when the Chinese youngsters go abroad for studies, they learn a lot of these civil society related matters. They try to go back and question some of these, even though many of their parents are Communist Party members and very apprehensive of the kind of repression that may ensue. So they are very cautious. The current generation is very cautious, but there is a huge pool of people, millions of people who went abroad, studied abroad. For example, in JNU, when many Chinese students come here, we see that they see the posters, they see the demonstrations, they see the political activity, and they get inspired. And when they go back to China, of course, they find a lot of tension in implementing those things. However, it remains in their psyche that oppression needs to be overcome through protests or through other democratic means. We did see a lot of Chinese students who came to JNU in this fashion. They see the posters, they see the authority being questioned, and they get inspired by these protests. So the younger generation are passing through a difficult phase because of this information blockade in China.